Welcome to the Graduated Thoughts Podcast.
Today, we're looking at Christopher Columbus and the violent restructuring of the Americas.
Right, and specifically, we're examining the massive gap between the sanitized heroification you find in mainstream textbooks.
Yeah, it's staggering.
And the brutal historical realities of conquest, enslavement, and indigenous devastation found in the primary sources.
Exactly. And the central disagreement we are diving into today is this. Was Christopher Columbus the principal architect who intentionally designed the modern racial and exploitative order? Or was he a catalyst? A product of broader, pre-existing European imperial and economic forces. I'll be taking the position that Columbus was the deliberate mastermind who instituted the specific blueprints for Native American genocide and the African Holocaust.
An engine driven by state-sponsored expropriation, emerging capitalism, and religious fanaticism.
So let's just get right into the text. We really have to look at the direct, personal agency Columbus had in reshaping the global racial order. Mainstream textbooks give us this origin myth of a bold explorer, but they completely omit that he explicitly introduced two world-altering phenomena: the expropriation of indigenous land and labor, and the transatlantic slave trade. If you read his own journal, the evidence is right there from day one. His immediate assessment of the Arawaks was that they would make, quote, good servants. His primary obsession was finding gold. He even equated gold with spiritual salvation, literally writing that it could lift souls up to paradise. And when his policies started killing the indigenous populations, he personally suggested replacing them with enslaved Africans, which directly initiated the African Holocaust. He wasn't just a bystander, he built the system.
I look at this from a very different angle, though.
Okay.
The outcomes you're describing are horrific, absolutely horrific. But Columbus was essentially an employee. He was executing the mandates of a vast geopolitical and religious machine, not operating as some solitary evil genius. You have to frame the 1492 voyage within the broader transition of 15th century Europe.
Sure, but
Wait, just look at the systemic nature of the conquest. Religious crusades were actively morphing into state-sponsored capitalism. Think about how these expeditions were funded. The Spanish crown actually confiscated the wealth of expelled Jews to finance Columbus's second voyage. That is a massive state-level enterprise in action. And regarding the devastating 95% population decline in the Americas, that was driven by a combination of introduced microbial pestilence and pre-existing ideological frameworks that viewed non-Europeans as subhuman.
I hear you on the systemic momentum, but if he was just an employee, as you say, how do you explain his specific, innovative policies?
Well, they weren't exactly innovative.
I disagree. Look at Hispaniola. He used religion as a deliberate rationalization for extreme greed. He demanded a tenth of all wealth. He immediately seized slaves. He imposed absolutely impossible gold quotas on the local population. That doesn't sound like a guy simply following a vague royal order. His specific policies established the exact blueprint for subsequent colonial domination. He created a racial underclass.
It sounds exactly like a guy following orders, because those were the standard tools of 15th century European empires. The pursuit of wealth, the brutal extraction of resources. Columbus didn't invent those mechanics. The Spanish crown and their merchant partnerships designed these expeditions for immediate profit to fund further conquests. The wealth they drained was explicitly meant to finance more expansion. Columbus was an agent of state-sponsored extraction.
An agent who personally catalyzed the greatest single Holocaust in human history.
He triggered it, yes, but
Let me just finish this point because we cannot ignore his personal responsibility here. When the Arawak and Carib populations began dying out from the brutal labor systems he personally oversaw, he didn't just passively watch. He pivoted. He explicitly petitioned Rome through Father Bartolomeo de las Casas to sanction the importation of enslaved Africans. That was his solution to a labor shortage he created.
I acknowledge that he triggered that specific phase in the Americas, But I want you to consider the institutional scale required to reduce indigenous populations from 30 million to under 6 million by 1650.
It's an unimaginable number.
Exactly. And a solitary architect does not accomplish that. That requires broader, systemic forces. Massive plagues, the deliberate agitation of racial strife by competing colonial powers. And regarding the slave trade, yes, Catholic nations initiated it, but it was the Protestant Dutch and English empires that later transformed it into the global big business that literally fueled the Industrial Revolution. The system was just so much larger than Columbus.
Which is exactly why how we teach this history matters so much. When mainstream textbooks intentionally sanitize Columbus, they aren't just protecting the legacy of one man. They are legitimizing the modern racial hierarchy and white Western domination.
Right.
By ignoring his role as a plunderer and slave trader, these texts validate the persistent systems of inequality that he personally helped build. It's a deliberate choice to obscure the violent origins of the modern world.
We are in complete agreement that the textbook narrative is mythological. It's deeply flawed. But I would argue that this sanitization protects the broader system of colonialism, not just the man himself.
How so?
Using Columbus as this sanitized origin myth creates a convenient buffer. It essentially excuses the centuries of continuous Euro-American genocide that followed him, stretching all the way to 19th century United States massacres like Wounded Knee. The focus must remain on the institutional power structures. If we fixate on Columbus as a solitary villain, we risk letting the vast machinery of empire entirely off the hook.
That's a fair point about the machinery of empire. But to sum up my position, after hearing your arguments, I still maintain that Columbus cannot be decoupled from his specific intentional acts. This is a man who evaluated human beings as good servants and instituted the policies that decimated populations. He drafted the very blueprints for a racial underclass.
And I maintain that he was the match that lit a massive powder keg of European capitalism and religious imperialism. The explosives were already laid by the geopolitical shifts of the 15th century. If it wasn't him, another navigator would have triggered that same systemic catastrophe.
Well, we might disagree on the exact weight of his architectural agency versus his role as a systemic catalyst, but we definitely have a strong point of convergence today. We both agree that the mainstream textbook narrative is a harmful colonialist myth.
Absolutely. It actively obscures the most massive acts of genocide in human history.
Right. There is incredible value in looking past those sanitized histories to truly understand the brutal realities of how the modern world was formed. The primary texts offer a depth that you just won't find in standard curricula.
I highly encourage anyone listening to dig into those original sources and historical analyses further. There's a lot more there.
We will leave the ultimate judgment of Columbus up to you, the listener. Thank you for joining us for this rigorous intellectual exchange.